your dive into the dynamic world of scholarly publishing, hosted by the scholarly publishing Teahouse Librarians of LaGuardia Community College. I'm Thomas Cleary, and today, joined by my fellow tea-loving librarians, we have
Ann Mitsuichi,
Silvia Lin Hanick,
Liz Jardine,
Steven Ovadia.
and here all to share insights and spark conversation on everything from open access to peer review, all served with a side of fun. Whether you're charting your first publication or navigating the seas of digital scholarship, our tea house is open to all. Ready to see what's brewing? Let's get started. So today, Liz, you have our topic about publishing in different venues, some that might be more unconventional or radical than in others.
Right. We've talked on our first few episodes a lot about peer-reviewed journals, predatory journals. There's other stuff out there in between, stuff that we haven't even touched on, and we wanted to talk about when might that be appropriate, who is it appropriate for, what are the risks, what things do you need to think about. So we have, actually, let's talk a little bit more about our special guests here. Steven Ovadia is coordinator of technical services here at LaGuardia Community College Library and is a full professor. Silvia Lin Hanick is the chief librarian and department chair of the library academic department and also a full professor?
Yep.
Okay. And your regular Tea House librarians, we're in different positions. Ann Matsuchi, you're full professor. I am a associate professor, but I do have tenure. Thomas?
I'm assistant professor, still going up for tenure.
Okay. So we are heavy on the full professors, but we have some other college ranks and tenure tracks represented. So let's think about, what is an unconventional or radical or risky choice? What kind of things would you put in those categories? Anyone wants to?
Well, I would start by saying that it's helpful to know that Steve has also served as acting chair and chief librarian of the library department. So I feel like that might color our responses. And I'm speaking from a perspective of, yes, having moved through the tenure track, but also as a representative on college-wide P&B personnel and budget. So that's where we look at folks as they move through the tenure process and various actions. And that question is so different from someone who has achieved tenure versus someone who hasn't. And so if you are someone who is a tenured full professor, risk could range from just prioritizing getting your ideas and thoughts out there and making sure that you prioritize audience over prestige or impact factor or those kinds of considerations. And I would bring the consideration of risk to a completely different plane if you are in your third or fourth year. And that conversation changes dramatically if you are still trying to move your way through the ranks.
Steve, do you have anything to add on that?
I mean, you're never gonna, as untenured faculty, you're never gonna change the rules. It's sort of a game with established parameters, and you can't really change them from below what you want to achieve. If it's tenure, if it's full, if it's wherever. Once you've gotten to a point, then you can kind of opt out and chart a new course. So I think that would be if somebody were to ask me about radical forms of scholarship, that would be my first question, where you are in your career, because something like OER, with I think that's a very interesting field. That's not, it wasn't when I was on P&B. It wasn't something that was really acknowledged as it didn't check the box of scholarship, and that's something that I think is that sort of speaks to people's personal passions, but that might not be rewarded by the systems we have.
But it can still be rewarding, right? I don't know if this is the right place to mention that Steve and I both have side hustles as reviewers. So yeah, Steve, do you want to mention your reviewing side gig?
Well, I think people you can just opt out of your scholarship too, or you can completely pivot to other things. I know Ann and I have talked over the years about like is peer review like really more robust than like putting something online where, you have a wider audience and you have comments and everybody can see the comments versus peer review, which is, like a very closed box, and the only person who sees the comments or the editor, the peer reviewer sees their own comments, presumably, but not a given. And then the author, where, on a public website or even like a Wikipedia entry, you have the whole conversation and it's all out there, and all of the digressions and the concerns and the counterpoints are there for everybody to read. So like, which is more, to me, that's like a much more robust process that's not going to be accepted at most institutions.
Right. I mean, that speaks to our collective. I mean, that's sort of the underlying theme of our series. I think, as we're talking about, opening the boundaries of public scholarship and what that means, and we need to sort of work with those definitions about what officially counts, right, in terms of what real scholarship is. I really like the way that you put it, Silvia, about visibility and making that decision between prestige over access, right? That's an extremely, I think, important point, right?
Yeah, I felt about the same as like going up for tenure. So I'm in archives. Our main documents that we produce are finding aids, and like with other archivists, we talk about how like they're never going to be considered as scholarly publications in any way because it doesn't go through peer review. You can spend years processing this collection, doing all this background research, but since it's missing that part, like it's just not going to count. And we always decide are we going to die on this hill to like get this to count, or do we just like go the more like traditional way of scholarship about, say, or something in archives related to it, and then just like post tenure then focus back onto these documents, which is like always a little bit of a weird thing because it's like a core part of your profession, core part of your academic work, but you just can't get recognized for it. You mentioned that a little bit, Steve, when I first started here. You're like, oh yeah, people aren't gonna like count that towards thing. I'm like, all right, I guess. And then also talking to other people about it, I'm like, oh, he was right, all right. We'll keep on going with this and try to figure out squeezing in some type of theme or topic related to what I do, but might not necessarily be what I do.
And I think that's reflected in a lot of different disciplines, and part of it is being at a community college where our focus is ultimately on teaching. I know about folks who have written hundreds of pages in an accreditation document that is hugely impactful and, filled with research and is deeply scholarly writing that is just it's not going to get you through that checkbox. And the same is true. There's a chair here at LaGuardia who talks about the travesty of law reviews or legal briefs not counting towards promotion or tenure in the way that they in their discipline would hope that it would. And so I think that's a struggle that your professional writing not matching with the expectations of academia I think it's shared across multiple disciplines.
And it's like in academia it's seen as like a radical departure from the standard, but like to these other groups it's like, no, that's just the normal. It's not even anything outside of like out there.
And that's been a big change from when I started, because when I started the conversation was much more about like professional communication, and just like the president used to walk around and the president at the time used to walk around and talk about like if a sculptor wants to write about how they like using like developing a special clay to use in the classroom for some reason, like that's like a valid form of scholarship. And then once you introduce peer review, like those types of things, case studies are often excluded from peer review. So this like mammoth and important thread of scholarship becomes, is off the table for people who are on the track.
Interestingly, we're more strict about sticking to your discipline than some of the other institutions that I'm familiar with. So here the standard is that you need to publish in your field. Now, the boundaries of that field I think can be porous, right? So a chemist or a historian can publish in a education/pedagogical journal, absolutely. But there are previous institutions that I'm familiar with where you can publish outside of your discipline, and that is fully valid towards promotion and tenure. And so an example of that being, if you are primarily, your area is like business and management. I knew a faculty member who was also writing historical romances. And, I remember someone who was a biologist, had a biology degree, but wrote like vampire fiction. And that was valid and accepted, right? And I think that tends to be like an area where at LaGuardia, at least, there's a little less flexibility.
As regards, you're mentioning that scholarship of teaching and learning, the chemists publishing in an educational journal. Some faculty are surprised that that is allowed based on where they've, I guess, had their previous education. I've had questions more to write about, this thing I did with my class and everything, and it sounds really great, but they think it's not scholarly, and it is. At a community college, which is student focused, that is an important part of scholarship for so many of the faculty here.
Yeah, and so maybe it's like, how radical how radical can we be in our approach? And I think that is maybe an area where in my conversations with faculty I'm seeing a little bit more of room to push, right? So speaking to someone who's focused in the visual arts and saying, you've had these really impactful collaborations with the archives and with other faculty in the social sciences, and you've been able to create these student-centered campaigns. You can write about that as much as you can write about, an art history topic in an art history journal.
But it's almost about primary versus second. Because if Thomas does a finding aid for 3 years, it's nope, sorry, buddy. But if he writes about using it,
or uses it in the research,
right? Then it's oh, this is fantastic, this is great.
Let's check that box.
Yeah, or OER. If you develop lessons or if you do the work of the work of teaching isn't necessarily acceptable for scholarship. But then if you write about it and through a lens or a framework or something, then suddenly it becomes oh, this is fantastic. You need that level of abstraction for whatever reason.
On the other side of it, though, I worry about non-traditional sources in that they might not be archived in the same way. It's how so many scholars are using Substack, right? Where is that being saved or kept? Or it's very public, but it's not. It's also not accessible, right? I mean, we don't have any. We struggle with finding systems of preserving that kind of content in the same way, right? I mean, although I suppose we might be able to use our institutional archive for such a thing, but people would have to voluntarily do that. They'd have to archive their own newsletter streams.
Yeah, to make sure it stays in the conversation.
Yeah.
Things.
And the tendency, I think, in this topic is for me to say, let's throw open the gates, but I also find value and support in the gates as well, right? So something that Liz, Thomas, and Anne talked about semi-recently is we were looking at a publisher that, by all accounts, checks the box. It absolutely meets the expectations of an academic publisher with a journal that, is indexed where you want it to be indexed. But it was also a journal that published in 1 year 17,000 articles. And it was the kind of thing, I think the example that I gave was it felt like Amazon, that next to a completely legitimate printer is a cardboard box with a smiley face drawn on it. And it's with that kind of volume and with that kind of mass-produced faculty output being packaged like an academic journal, that doesn't feel great. And so that's where I would also say, pick a place to publish that doesn't land you in that gray area of, is this legitimate? How hard do I have to look at your writing and your work to make sure that, it meets those standards or the academic conventions of your discipline?
Yeah, I think for folks who are on the tenure track, even venturing too close to the gray area, depending on their institution and what kind of parameters they have, could be risky. But for somebody who's a full professor, and maybe they kind of fell across something really interesting, but it's not their specialty. They don't want to pursue it, but put it out there as here's something, and take it and run with it. That could be a great place to just put like a very brief thing that's not going to be probably closely scrutinized with the other 16,999 articles that are being published. That could be good. How far, as we're moving along on our time here, how radical would any of you go in publishing? Just as an interesting thought experiment.
Post tenure, like who knows?
Yeah, it all depends on what it is and how widely you want to get the word out about what it is you're talking about, right? I mean, again, making that decision about access versus prestige, right?
Yeah, or even I'm thinking about like my post tenure writing, and that's where I've prioritized writing outside of my official area of study because I just wanted to work with my friend. And if we committed to a writing project, then we would be meeting weekly for a year, and making time to hang out with my friend was a real academic priority for me. I'm an anonymous reviewer for Kirkus.
Not anymore.
Well, yeah, I can't tell you what I've reviewed, but I can tell you that I'm a Kirkus reviewer for their young readers titles. So I review picture books, I review, fantasy YA. I write these reviews between, 160, 250 words, so they are quite brief. And I don't have a byline, right? And so I do it simply because it's fun to write and it's fun to think, and I know that those words will be read and people will use my hopefully helpful critique and opinion to guide their purchasing for young readers. And so like prioritizing like that kind of influence or those kind of writing conditions completely changes after tenure. I'm also a series editor for a Bloomsbury imprint, and that is really just so that I can read manuscripts from other librarians who are writing about cool stuff that I don't know about. And I don't think I would have done that before tenure. It's after tenure that I've created space for myself to engage with the discipline and engage with the profession on a level that is just so much more exploratory and imaginative.
Great. Well, thanks for your time. As we reach the end of today's Teahouse Chat, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us and thank the listeners for joining us too, as we shared our thoughts about sort of publishing in unconventional spaces, when you kind of have to stick to publishing in a conventional space. And we hope you found some fresh ideas and inspiration for your own scholarly publishing journey. Let us hear from you. Share your thoughts, questions, or suggestions for future topics. Your insights make our tea house richer. You can connect to us via website or email. The addresses are shown in our notes. Let's keep the conversation brewing, and don't forget to subscribe to our Teahouse Chats for your monthly sip of scholarly success. Until next time, keep the kettle warm and your ideas flowing.